The northern reaches of Scotland are a land of quiet isolation, where sprawling valleys and jagged peaks stretch endlessly under a perpetually gray sky. At the edge of this rugged wilderness lay Glenrothes, a village so small and obscure that it rarely appeared on maps. Time seemed to pass differently here. Days drifted into years as the villagers, many of whom had lived in Glenrothes for generations, carried on with their lives in much the same way their ancestors had. The air was crisp and still, the kind of silence that could either soothe or unsettle, depending on one's disposition. At first glance, Glenrothes appeared to be the epitome of pastoral tranquility. Smoke curled lazily from the chimneys of stone cottages. Sheep grazed peacefully in the surrounding meadows, and the distant sound of the river cascading over rocks lent a soothing rhythm to the days. Yet, beneath this idyllic surface, a sense of unease clung to the village like a shadow, hard to pinpoint but impossible to ignore. It wasn't something the villagers spoke about openly, but it hung in the air, a lingering presence, like the mist that refused to lift, no matter how bright the sun. The stories varied. Of course, some were old tales of curses and witches, of spirits bound to the land, whispered by firelight to wide-eyed children. Others were more recent, accounts of strange lights flickering in the woods, of animals disappearing without a trace, or of travelers who ventured too far into the surrounding moors and never returned. Most dismissed these tales as mere superstition, but even the most skeptical residents couldn't entirely shake the feeling that something about Glenrothes wasn't quite right. Thomas was one of the few who never indulged in such talk, a solitary man in his mid-40s. He lived in a modest wooden cabin on the outskirts of the village, just where the dense forest began to encroach on the cultivated fields. He kept to himself, tending to his garden, chopping firewood, and occasionally fishing in the nearby stream. The villagers didn't know much about him, and that was just the way Thomas liked it. He wasn't unfriendly, exactly, but he had a knack for ending conversations before they could get too personal. It wasn't that Thomas didn't notice the oddities of Glenrothes. He noticed everything. He had a quiet, watchful nature that allowed him to observe details others might overlook. But he'd long ago decided that the best way to live in a place like Glenrothes was to mind his own business. That resolve was tested one particularly cold and foggy autumn evening. Thomas had been sitting by the fireplace, a cup of tea warming his hands, when he heard it, a low, mournful sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the wind, it was deeper, more resonant, like the hum of a cello string. The sound came from the direction of the forest, its steady rhythm almost hypnotic. Thomas set down his cup and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The moon was a faint smudge behind the clouds, offering little illumination. At first, he saw nothing unusual. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their branches casting skeletal shadows on the ground. But then, just as he was about to turn away, something flickered at the edge of his vision, a faint, reddish light, pulsing softly among the trees. A knot of unease formed in his stomach. He told himself it was probably nothing, perhaps someone from the village wandering the woods with a lantern. Yet, the light didn't move the way a lantern would. It seemed to hover, shifting slightly, as though it were alive. Thomas stood frozen, debating whether to investigate. Logic told him to stay inside. Whatever it wasn't his concern. But the longer he stared at the light, the more he felt an inexplicable pull, a nagging sense that he couldn't ignore. Grabbing his coat and a flashlight, Thomas stepped outside. The cold hit him like a slap, sharp and biting, but he barely noticed. His focus was entirely on the light, which continued to pulse faintly, drawing him toward the woods. As he approached the tree line, the sound he'd heard earlier grew louder. It wasn't just a hum anymore. It was layered, almost musical, with notes that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. The light, too, grew brighter, though it remained elusive, always just out of reach. Thomas ventured deeper into the forest, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The ground was soft and damp underfoot, muffling his steps. The air smelled of moss and decaying leaves, a rich, earthy scent that was almost suffocating. He was about to turn back, convinced he was chasing a trick of the light, when he saw it. The clearing was sudden, as though the forest itself had decided to part for him. At its center stood a large, gnarled tree, its twisted branches reaching skyward like the fingers of a skeletal hand. Beneath the tree, the reddish light pooled on the ground, pulsating in time with the strange, otherworldly sound. And then Thomas saw the figure. It was hunched, almost obscured by the tree's massive trunk, but there was no mistaking it, a human shape, motionless, staring directly at him. Thomas froze, his heart hammering in his chest. For a moment, neither of them moved. "Who's there?" Thomas called, his voice steadier than he felt. The figure didn't respond, but something about its posture shifted, as though it were leaning toward him. The light grew brighter, illuminating the figure's outline, a gaunt, almost skeletal form draped in what looked like tattered cloth. Thomas took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to run. But just as he turned to leave, the figure raised an arm, pointing toward him. The motion was impossibly fast, a blur that defied the laws of nature. At the same time, the pulsing light surged, blindingly bright, and the sound reached a deafening crescendo. Thomas stumbled, shielding his eyes. When the light finally dimmed, the figure was gone. The clearing was empty, the tree standing silent and still as though nothing had happened. Shaken, Thomas made his way back to his cabin, glancing over his shoulder every few steps. The forest seemed darker now, the shadows deeper and more oppressive. When he finally reached the safety of his home, he locked the door and sat by the fire, his hands trembling. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, a trick of the light and the wind. But deep down, he knew better. Something was wrong in Glenrothes, something that went beyond the old stories and superstitions. That night, as the fire burned low and the forest outside his window seemed to press closer, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The next morning dawned gray and sluggish, as if the sun itself hesitated to rise over Glenrothes. Thomas, despite his best efforts, had not slept well. His mind had replayed the events of the previous night on an endless loop, the haunting light, the unearthly sound, and the figure beneath the tree. He'd gone over every rational explanation he could think of, from hallucinations to a misinterpreted shadow, but none of them felt right. As he stared out of his kitchen window, nursing a mug of lukewarm coffee, his attention was drawn to movement outside, across the narrow dirt path that separated his cabin from his nearest neighbor's home. Edward and Margaret's house stood as it always had, a modest, two-story stone structure, its roof perpetually slick with moss. This morning, however, something seemed different. Thomas couldn't quite place it at first, but the house had an air of neglect about it. The curtains in the upstairs window were drawn unevenly, one side drooping as though it had been hastily pulled shut. The garden, which Margaret usually kept immaculately tidy, was overgrown, with weeds poking through the once neat rows of vegetables. And then there was Edward. Thomas spotted him by the side of the house, standing unnaturally still, his back turned to the road. He seemed to be staring intently at something on the ground, though Thomas couldn't see what. Edward was a stocky man in his 50s, usually bustling with energy and good humor. But the figure before Thomas now seemed oddly diminished. His shoulders sagged, his head hung low, and his hands hung limply by his sides. Thomas frowned. It wasn't like Edward to linger outside like that, especially in the chill of an autumn morning. For a moment, he considered calling out to him, but something held him back, a feeling, subtle but insistent, that it would be better not to intrude. Instead, he turned his attention to Margaret, who was visible through the kitchen window. She was moving about inside, her motions quick and jittery, as if she were performing chores in a frantic rush. Every so often, she would glance toward the window, her eyes darting nervously, as though expecting to see someone or something outside. Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The Margaret and Edward he knew were steady, dependable people. Margaret, in particular, had always been the heart of the village's social life, quick with a kind word or a warm loaf of bread for anyone who needed it. But the woman he saw now was a shadow of that person, her movements erratic, her face pale and drawn. Over the next few days, Thomas began to notice more oddities about his neighbors. Edward, once a jovial presence around the village, stopped coming into town altogether. He used to visit the pub every evening, exchanging jokes and stories with the locals, but now he was nowhere to be seen. Margaret, meanwhile, grew even more reclusive. When Thomas passed by their house on his way to the stream, she would peek out from behind the curtains, her face half hidden but unmistakably tense. Then came the noises. Late at night, when the village was blanketed in silence, Thomas would hear strange sounds coming from Edward and Margaret's house. At first, they were faint, an occasional thud, like a door slamming or furniture being moved. But as the nights passed, the sounds grew louder and more unsettling. There were scraping noises, as though something heavy was being dragged across the floor, and muffled voices raised in what sounded like an argument. One night, Thomas awoke to a sharp, metallic clang that echoed through the stillness. He sat up in bed, his heart racing, and listened intently. For a moment, there was silence, and he wondered if he'd imagined it. But then it came again, a low, grinding sound, like metal on stone. Unable to ignore it any longer, Thomas pulled on his boots and jacket and stepped outside. The air was cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke. He crossed the dirt path cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, and approached Edward and Margaret's house. The grinding sound had stopped, but now there was something else, a low, rhythmic thumping, almost like footsteps but heavier, more deliberate. Thomas froze, his flashlight beam trembling slightly as he scanned the house. And then he saw it. The upstairs window, where the curtains had been drawn haphazardly earlier in the week, was now wide open. A pale hand reached out from the shadows, its fingers curling around the windowsill. For a moment, Thomas thought he saw a face, a fleeting glimpse of something gaunt and pale, with eyes that burned like coals, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. Thomas stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. He wanted to call out, to demand an explanation, but his voice seemed caught in his chest. Instead, he retreated to his cabin, locking the door behind him and bolting it for good measure. The next day, Thomas resolved to confront Margaret. Whatever was going on in that house, it was no longer something he could ignore. He waited until mid-morning, when the sun had risen high enough to burn off the worst of the mist, and made his way over. He knocked on the door, his knuckles striking the weathered wood with more force than he intended. For a moment, there was no response. Then, just as he was about to knock again, the door creaked open. Margaret stood there, her face pale and drawn. There was a deep cut running along her cheek, raw and angry, as though it had been made recently. She smiled weakly, though the expression didn't reach her eyes. "Thomas," she said, her voice shaky, "what brings you by?" "I just wanted to check on you," Thomas said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "You and Edward, everything all right?" Margaret's smile faltered. For a moment, she seemed on the verge of saying something, her mouth opening slightly, but then she shook her head. "We're fine," she said quickly. "Nothing to worry about." Thomas frowned, his eyes lingering on the cut on her face. "That doesn't look fine," he said, gesturing to her cheek. "What happened?" "Oh, this?" Margaret touched the wound lightly, as if she'd only just remembered it was there. "It's nothing, just an accident in the kitchen. I'm a bit clumsy these days." Her laugh was brittle, forced, and it sent a shiver down Thomas's spine. Before he could press her further, Margaret stepped back, beginning to close the door. "Thank you for checking in, Thomas, but we're really fine. Just busy. You know how it is." And with that, the door shut with a finality that left Thomas standing on the porch, his questions unanswered. As he turned to leave, a movement in the upstairs window caught his eye. He looked up just in time to see Edward's face peering out, his expression blank and unreadable. Their eyes met briefly before Edward stepped back into the shadows, disappearing from view. Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening inside that house, it was far from over. The night was clear and bright, the full moon casting a silver glow over Glen Rothes. The usual mist that clung to the village seemed to retreat, as if the moonlight was too strong for it to hold. Thomas had spent the evening trying to lose himself in the pages of a novel. But his thoughts continually drifted back to his neighbors. The unease he'd felt since his conversation with Margaret had only deepened. Something wasn't right, and the strange noises from their house weren't helping. It was well past midnight when the noise began again, a low, rhythmic pounding that seemed to echo through the stillness. At first, Thomas thought it might be coming from inside his own cabin, the product of his restless mind playing tricks on him. But as he sat up in bed and listened more closely, he realized it was coming from outside. The sound wasn't the only thing that drew his attention. A faint glow, reddish and dim, flickered through his window, coming from the direction of Edward and Margaret's house. It was unlike the warm yellow light of a lantern or candle. This light felt wrong, as though it didn't belong to this world. Thomas hesitated, his instinct screaming at him to stay inside. But curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, compelled him to rise from his bed. Grabbing his flashlight and coat, he approached the window cautiously, peering through the glass into the night. He saw Edward. The man was walking down the narrow path leading to his house, his steps jerky and uneven, as though his legs didn't quite know how to move properly. He clutched a large, misshapen bag in one hand, its fabric dark and stained. The bag sagged heavily, and with every step Edward took, it swung slightly, leaving a faint trail of liquid on the ground behind him. Thomas's heart began to race. There was something about Edward's movements that was deeply unsettling, almost inhuman. He wasn't merely tired or drunk. His entire posture seemed wrong, his head hanging low and his shoulders hunched unnaturally forward. Edward stopped in front of his door, raising his free hand to knock. His voice, when he spoke, was loud enough for Thomas to hear even through the closed window. "Margaret, open the door." The words were sharp and guttural, filled with an anger that made Thomas flinch. He had never heard Edward speak like that before. The man had always been mild-mannered, his voice tinged with warmth and humor. But this was something else entirely. The door opened slowly, and Margaret stepped into view. She looked different, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide and glassy. She stared at Edward without saying a word, her expression blank and distant. Thomas couldn't tear his eyes away. He watched as Edward thrust the bag toward her, the movement abrupt and almost violent. Margaret took it without hesitation, holding it close to her chest despite the dark liquid that dripped from its seams. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, as if by some unspoken signal, they both disappeared into the house, the door closing behind them with a heavy thud. Thomas exhaled shakily, realizing only then that he had been holding his breath. He debated whether to investigate further but decided against it. Whatever was happening in that house, he wasn't ready to face it, not yet. The next morning, Thomas stepped outside to find the trail of dark liquid still visible on the dirt path. It had dried in places, leaving behind an almost rust-colored stain. He followed it cautiously, his eyes scanning the ground for any further clues. The trail led straight to Edward and Margaret's front door, but beyond that, it disappeared. Thomas knocked on the door, his knuckles trembling slightly as they made contact with the wood. There was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time, but still, no one came. "Margaret? Edward?" he called, his voice sounding small against the oppressive silence. After several long moments, he turned to leave, but a faint noise stopped him. It was coming from the side of the house, a soft, shuffling sound, as though something was being dragged across the ground. Thomas followed the sound, his heart pounding in his chest. As he rounded the corner, he caught sight of Margaret standing by the garden. She was bent over something, her back to him, and her movements were slow and deliberate. "Margaret," he called out hesitantly. She froze. For a moment, she didn't turn around, and Thomas began to wonder if she had even heard him. But then, slowly, she straightened up and turned to face him. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. Margaret's face was pale, almost unnaturally so, and there was a vacant look in her eyes that made his stomach churn. But it was the gash on her cheek that truly unsettled him. It was deeper now, the edges jagged and raw, as though it hadn't begun to heal at all. "Thomas," she said, her voice soft and distant. "What are you doing here?" "I was just checking on you," he stammered. "Are you all right? You don't look." Margaret smiled, but it was a strange, hollow expression. "I'm fine," she said. "Just fine. Thank you for your concern." She gestured toward the garden, where a pile of dark soil lay heaped beside a freshly dug hole. At first, Thomas thought she was burying something, a bag of compost, perhaps, or some rotting vegetables. But as his eyes adjusted to the light, he saw something sticking out of the earth. It was pale and smooth, with a faintly pink hue. It looked disturbingly like a bone. Thomas took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. What are you burying?" he asked, his voice trembling. Margaret tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Just some leftovers," she said lightly. "Nothing to worry about." Before he could respond, Edward's voice rang out from inside the house. "Margaret, get back in here." She flinched at the sound, her body tensing as though she'd been struck. Without another word, she turned and hurried toward the house, leaving Thomas alone in the garden. That night, Thomas was jolted awake by a blood-curdling scream. It was loud and piercing, cutting through the stillness of the night like a blade. He leapt out of bed, his heart racing as he grabbed his flashlight and ran outside. The scream had come from Edward and Margaret's house, and as he approached, he saw a strange, flickering light emanating from the windows. It wasn't the reddish glow he had seen before. It was brighter, more chaotic, like the light of a fire. Thomas hesitated at the front door, his hand hovering over the doorknob. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed inside, accompanied by muffled voices raised in anger. "Margaret, no!" Edward's voice roared, followed by a loud crash. Thomas pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of burning wood and something else, something acrid and metallic that made his stomach churn. The scene before him was chaos. Furniture lay overturned, the walls streaked with dark stains. In the center of the room stood Edward, his face twisted in rage. He held a large, bloodied axe in one hand, his knuckles white from the force of his grip. Margaret was cowering in the corner, her hands raised defensively. Her face was streaked with tears, and the gash on her cheek had deepened, the flesh around it blackened and rotting. Edward turned toward Thomas, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "Get out," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the room. "This doesn't concern you." Thomas took a step back, his hands raised in surrender. "I don't want any trouble," he said, his voice trembling. "I just want to help." Edward let out a harsh, guttural laugh. "Help? You don't understand, do you? It's too late for help." Before Thomas could respond, Edward lunged toward him, raising the axe high above his head. Thomas barely had time to react, stumbling backward and falling to the floor. The axe came down with a sickening thud, embedding itself in the wooden floorboards just inches from his head. Seizing the opportunity, Thomas scrambled to his feet and bolted out the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't stop running until he was back in his cabin, the door locked and bolted behind him. From the safety of his home, Thomas watched as the strange, flickering light in Edward and Margaret's house gradually dimmed, until the village was once again plunged into darkness. But the screams continued, echoing through the night and haunting Thomas long after they had faded into silence. The morning air hung heavy over Glenrothes, as though the night had refused to let go of its grip. Thomas woke with a start, his dreams a chaotic jumble of dark woods, glowing eyes, and Margaret's hollow smile. The sense of unease he had carried over the past few days had reached a crescendo, and as he swung his feet out of bed and placed them on the cold floor, he couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. He moved to the window, his eyes scanning the dirt path that stretched between his cabin and Edward and Margaret's house. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the burlap bag lying there, abandoned in the middle of the road like a grim monument to the events of the previous night. The bag was large, its coarse fabric darkened by stains that Thomas didn't want to think too hard about. A faint trail of dried liquid stretched from the bag to the front door of Edward and Margaret's house, like breadcrumbs leading to a nightmare. Thomas stood frozen for a moment, his breath fogging the glass of the window. He knew he should leave it alone. He had no reason to involve himself further in whatever horrors were unfolding in that house. But the longer he stared at the bag, the stronger the pull became, a morbid curiosity gnawing at the edges of his mind. Before he fully realized what he was doing, Thomas had thrown on his coat and boots and stepped outside. The air was cold and damp, carrying with it the faint, metallic tang of blood. He approached the bag cautiously, each step feeling heavier than the last. The closer he got, the worse the smell became, a sickly, rancid odor that turned his stomach. When he reached the bag, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the edge of the fabric. His mind screamed at him to stop, to turn back, to leave this cursed thing alone. But he couldn't. Something deeper, a primal need to understand, to uncover the truth, compelled him forward. With a deep breath, Thomas grasped the edge of the bag and pulled it open. The contents of the bag hit him like a physical blow. Inside was a severed human head. Thomas stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. He fell to his knees, bile rising in his throat as the grisly image seared itself into his mind. The face was unmistakable. It was Margaret, or at least, it looked like her. The pale blue eyes stared blankly into nothingness, and the faint scar on her forehead was exactly where he remembered it. But there was something wrong, something he couldn't quite put into words. The features were too perfect, too lifeless, as though they had been sculpted rather than born. The skin lacked the subtle imperfections of a living person, and the hair, though carefully styled, looked unnaturally stiff, almost like doll's hair. Thomas scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked toward Edward and Margaret's house, half expecting someone to burst out and accuse him of trespassing. But the house remained silent, its windows dark and uninviting. And then the door creaked open. Thomas froze, his body tense with fear. Margaret stepped into view, her figure framed by the doorway. She looked alive, whole, and completely unbothered. Her face was smooth and pale, with no sign of the deep gash he had seen days before. She smiled at him, a cold, distant smile that sent a shiver down his spine. "You shouldn't be poking around, Thomas," she said, her voice calm and even, as though she were scolding a curious child. Thomas's mouth went dry. I thought something might have happened," he stammered. Margaret's smile widened, but her eyes remained as cold and lifeless as the head in the bag. "Something has happened," she said, her tone almost playful. "But that's no concern of yours." Before Thomas could respond, Edward appeared behind her. He stepped into the doorway, his broad frame filling the space. His face was gaunt, his eyes bloodshot and wild. There were dark stains on his hands and shirt, and his expression was one of barely contained fury. "What's he doing here?" Edward growled, his voice low and menacing. Margaret placed a calming hand on his arm, her smile never faltering. "He's just curious," she said. "That's all." Edward's gaze fixed on Thomas, his eyes narrowing. "Curiosity can get a man killed," he said, his voice dripping with venom. Thomas took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to run. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said quickly. "I was just—" "Leave," Edward snapped, cutting him off. "Now." Thomas didn't need to be told twice. He turned and hurried back to his cabin, his pulse pounding in his ears. He locked the door behind him and leaned against it, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. From the window, he watched Edward and Margaret. They stood in the doorway, watching him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. After what felt like an eternity, they turned and disappeared back into the house, the door closing with a heavy thud. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Thomas couldn't concentrate on anything, his thoughts consumed by the image of the severed head and Margaret's too perfect smile. He considered going to the village constable, but what could he say? That he'd found a human head in a bag, only to have the supposed owner of that head greet him minutes later? It was madness, and he knew no one would believe him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the village into darkness, Thomas's unease grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that unseen eyes were tracking his every move. He checked the locks on his doors and windows multiple times, but it did little to calm his nerves. Late that night, the noises began again. At first, they were faint, soft thuds and scraping sounds, as though furniture was being moved. But as the hours passed, the noises grew louder and more erratic. There were crashes, muffled shouts, and what sounded disturbingly like an animal growling. Thomas sat in his chair, his hands gripping the arms so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He wanted to ignore it, to pretend he couldn't hear the chaos unfolding next door. But when a blood-curdling scream pierced the night, all thoughts of self-preservation vanished. He grabbed his flashlight and coat and stepped outside, the cold night air biting at his skin. The reddish glow was back, spilling out of Edward and Margaret's windows like a beacon. It pulsed rhythmically, casting eerie shadows that danced across the yard. Thomas approached cautiously, his footsteps silent on the dirt path. He reached the side of the house and peered through one of the windows, his heart pounding in his chest. What he saw inside made his blood run cold. Edward stood in the center of the room, his body hunched and trembling. His hands were covered in blood, which dripped steadily onto the floor. Margaret lay on the ground at his feet, her body contorted in a way that no living person could survive. And yet, she was alive, her head twisted unnaturally to face him, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her mouth moved, forming words that Thomas couldn't hear. Edward raised his hands, and for a moment, Thomas thought he was going to strike her, but instead, he plunged them into her chest, his fingers digging into her flesh as though it were soft clay. The reddish glow intensified, filling the room with its sickly light. Margaret let out a guttural scream, her body writhing violently. Edward's hands moved with purpose, shaping something inside her, as though he were sculpting a piece of art. Thomas stumbled back, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. He turned and ran, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he sprinted back to his cabin. He locked the door behind him and collapsed onto the floor, his body trembling with fear. That night, he didn't sleep. The sounds from Edward and Margaret's house continued long into the early hours, a symphony of madness that would haunt him for the rest of his life. By morning, the noises had stopped, but Thomas knew, deep down, that whatever had happened in that house was far from over. The days that followed the events in Edward and Margaret's house were a blur for Thomas. He barely slept, jumping at every creak of his wooden cabin or the faint rustle of wind through the trees. Though the noises from the neighbor's home had quieted, the eerie glow that often radiated from their windows lingered in his mind like an afterimage burned into his vision. He wanted to convince himself that it was over, that whatever horrors he had witnessed were behind him. But deep down, he knew better. Glenrothes itself seemed to sense the tension. The villagers, usually friendly and quick with a greeting, now avoided the dirt path leading to Edward and Margaret's house. Even the cheerful chatter that once filled the square had grown hushed, as though the entire village was holding its breath. If anyone else had noticed the strange happenings, they weren't talking about it. And Thomas, burdened by the weight of what he'd seen, couldn't bring himself to start the conversation. One morning, driven by an uneasy mixture of curiosity and dread, Thomas decided to venture out. His water supply was running low, and he needed to fetch more from the well in the village square. It would be a simple task, quick, routine, safe, or so he told himself. As he approached the well, the chill of the autumn air bit at his cheeks. The square was mostly empty, save for a few villagers milling about, their heads down and their movements hurried. Thomas ignored their fleeting glances and focused on his task, lowering the bucket into the dark, still water. But as he drew the bucket back up, he froze. The water inside shimmered red, as though tainted with blood. For a moment, he stared, his breath catching in his throat. Then he blinked, and the water was clear again, pristine and sparkling in the pale sunlight. His hands trembled as he poured the water into his container. Was his mind playing tricks on him? "Thomas," a voice called from behind him, startling him so badly that he nearly dropped the bucket. He turned sharply to see Margaret standing a few paces away. Her face was pale but otherwise unmarked, the deep gash he had seen just days earlier completely gone. She looked wrong, not in any obvious way, but in the subtleties, the overly smooth texture of her skin, the unnatural stillness of her posture, the way her eyes seemed to bore into him without blinking. "You've been avoiding us," she said, her voice light and cheerful, but with an undertone that sent a shiver down his spine. "We were starting to worry." Thomas forced a smile, though his unease was palpable. "I've been busy," he said, his voice strained. "Things to take care of." Margaret stepped closer, her movements unnaturally fluid. "Busy? That's no excuse for neglecting your neighbors. You should come by for tea sometime. Edward would like that." The mention of Edward made Thomas's stomach turn. He shook his head quickly. "I don't think." Margaret cut him off with a laugh, the sound sharp and grating. "Nonsense. You've always been welcome in our home. Thomas, we've missed your company." There was a strange glint in her eyes as she spoke, a flicker of something dark and malevolent just beneath the surface. Thomas took an instinctive step back, gripping the bucket tightly as though it were a shield. "I'll think about it," he said hastily, desperate to end the conversation. "But I really need to get back now." Margaret's smile faltered for the briefest of moments, her expression turning cold. But then, just as quickly, the smile returned, wider and more unsettling than before. "Suit yourself," she said, "but don't stay away too long. We wouldn't want you to feel left out." Thomas hurried away, the weight of her words pressing heavily on his chest. As he retreated to the safety of his cabin, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that Margaret's unblinking gaze was still fixed on him even from a distance. That night, the noises returned. At first, they were faint, a low, rhythmic thudding that seemed to echo through the stillness. But as the hours wore on, the sounds grew louder, more erratic. There was a crash, followed by the unmistakable sound of wood splintering. Then came the voices, muffled at first, then rising to frantic, angry shouts. Thomas lay in bed, his heart pounding as he listened. He tried to block it out, pulling the covers over his head, but the noise seemed to seep into his very bones. It wasn't just the sounds of an argument. There was something primal in those voices, something inhuman. And then came the scream. It was high-pitched and guttural, a sound so raw and full of pain that it made Thomas sit bolt upright. He stumbled out of bed, his legs trembling beneath him. The scream had come from Edward in Margaret's house. He hesitated, torn between his fear and a sense of duty. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to stay inside, to lock the door and pretend he hadn't heard anything. But he couldn't. Not this time. Grabbing his flashlight and a sturdy piece of firewood, Thomas stepped outside. The night was deathly quiet, save for the faint hum of crickets. He made his way toward the house, his steps cautious and deliberate. The reddish glow was back, spilling out from the windows and casting eerie shadows on the ground. As he approached, he noticed the front door was slightly ajar. He hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. Then, summoning every ounce of courage he could muster, he pushed the door open. The sight that greeted him was nothing short of a nightmare. The living room was in disarray, the furniture overturned and the walls streaked with dark stains. The reddish glow seemed to emanate from the very air itself, pulsing like a heartbeat. In the center of the room stood Edward, his back to Thomas. He was hunched over something, his hands moving with a strange, mechanical precision. "Edward." Thomas's voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. Edward froze, his shoulders tensing. Slowly, he turned to face Thomas. His face was a mask of rage, his eyes bloodshot and wild. His hands were covered in blood, and in one of them, he clutched a jagged piece of metal. "You shouldn't be here," Edward growled, his voice low and guttural. "This isn't for you to see." Thomas's eyes darted to the floor, where Margaret lay motionless. Her body was contorted, her limbs bent at impossible angles. But her eyes, those pale, unblinking eyes, were wide open, fixed on him with an intensity that made his stomach churn. What are you doing?" Thomas stammered, his voice trembling. Edward let out a harsh, barking laugh. "Fixing her," he said. "She's not perfect yet." Before Thomas could react, Edward lunged toward him, the jagged metal glinting in the reddish light. Thomas stumbled back, raising the piece of firewood in a desperate attempt to defend himself. The two men collided, the force of the impact sending them both crashing to the ground. For a moment, There was chaos, grunting, scrambling, the clatter of the metal hitting the floor. Then, with a surge of adrenaline, Thomas managed to push Edward off him. He scrambled to his feet, his heart racing as he bolted for the door. He didn't stop running until he was back in his cabin. The door locked and bolted behind him. His chest heaved as he struggled to catch his breath, his mind racing with the horrors he had just witnessed. From his window, he could see the reddish glow fading from Edward and Margaret's house. But the screams, those raw, inhuman screams, echoed in his mind long after the night had fallen silent. Whatever Edward had been doing, whatever Margaret had become, it was far from over. And Thomas knew, deep in his soul, that he was running out of time. The screams began just after midnight. At first, Thomas thought he was dreaming. He sat up in his bed, the sound still echoing in his ears, and held his breath, waiting to hear if it would come again. For a moment, the night was quiet, save for the faint rustling of leaves outside his window. Then it came again, louder this time, cutting through the stillness like a knife. Thomas swung his legs over the edge of the bed, his pulse racing. The scream didn't sound human. It was guttural, raw, and filled with an emotion he couldn't place. Pain, perhaps, but also rage. He moved to the window and peered out into the darkness. The village of Glenrothes was still, bathed in pale moonlight. From his vantage point, he could see Edward and Margaret's house. It looked the same as it always had, dark, silent, and unwelcoming. But the scream had come from there. Thomas was certain of it. A faint reddish glow flickered in one of the windows, almost too faint to notice. His chest tightened. He had seen that light before. It was the same otherworldly glow that had haunted him for weeks now, spilling out from Edward and Margaret's home like some spectral warning. The scream came again, more piercing than before. Thomas flinched, his hand gripping the windowsill so tightly his knuckles turned white. He knew he should stay inside. Whatever was happening in that house was none of his business, and yet, he couldn't ignore the nagging sense of responsibility that tugged at him. Grabbing his flashlight and a thick coat, he stepped outside into the crisp night air. The village seemed to hold its breath as he made his way toward Edward and Margaret's house. The dirt path felt longer than usual, each step echoing loudly in the stillness. When he reached the front door, he hesitated. The faint glow seeped out from the cracks in the wood, casting long, flickering shadows on the porch. The door was slightly ajar, just as it had been the last time he had approached. Thomas's gut churned as he pushed it open. The interior of the house was even more chaotic than before. Furniture was overturned, the walls streaked with dark stains. The reddish light pulsed like a heartbeat, illuminating the room in brief, flickering bursts. "Edward," Thomas called, his voice trembling. No response. He stepped further inside, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood and something else, something acrid and unnatural that burned his nostrils. In the corner of the room, a figure was slumped against the wall. Thomas approached cautiously, his footsteps silent on the wooden floor. As the beam of his flashlight fell on the figure, he gasped. It was Edward. The man was barely recognizable. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets. His hands were covered in blood, his fingers twitching as if they were trying to grasp something invisible. "Thomas," Edward's voice was weak, barely above a whisper. He looked up, his bloodshot eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. "What happened?" Thomas asked, his heart pounding. Edward's lips moved, but no sound came out. Then, with a sudden burst of strength, he grabbed Thomas's arm. His grip was surprisingly strong, his fingers digging into Thomas's flesh. "Don't let her in," Edward rasped, his voice cracking with the effort. Before Thomas could respond, Edward's body convulsed violently. His eyes rolled back into his head, and he let out a low, guttural moan before collapsing against the wall. Thomas stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He turned toward the doorway, his flashlight beam sweeping the room. The reddish glow seemed to grow brighter, more insistent, as if it were alive. And then he heard it, the sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from upstairs. The hair on the back of Thomas's neck stood on end as the sound grew louder, each step creaking against the wooden floorboards above. "Margaret," he called, though he already knew the answer. The footsteps stopped abruptly. The house fell silent once more, save for the faint hum of the pulsing light. Thomas stood frozen, his flashlight shaking in his hand. Then, without warning, the footsteps resumed, this time descending the stairs. Thomas's fight-or-flight instincts kicked in. He backed toward the door, his eyes fixed on the staircase. The reddish light seemed to gather at the top of the stairs, coalescing into a swirling, shapeless mass. And then Margaret appeared. Her movements were jerky, almost puppet-like, as she descended the stairs. Her face was pale and smooth, her features eerily perfect, but her eyes, those cold, lifeless eyes, were fixed on Thomas with an intensity that made his blood run cold. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice strangely calm. Thomas took another step back, his mind racing. "Margaret, what's going on? What happened to Edward?" Margaret tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Edward couldn't handle it," she said simply. "He wasn't strong enough." "Strong enough for what?" Thomas demanded, his voice rising in panic. Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile. "To see the truth." Before Thomas could react, the reddish light flared brightly, blinding him. He stumbled backward, shielding his eyes. When the light faded, Margaret was standing right in front of him, her movements unnaturally quick. She reached out, her cold fingers brushing against his cheek. "You've seen too much, Thomas," she murmured, "and now you'll have to join us." Thomas felt a sharp pain in his chest, as if something were burrowing into him. He cried out, his knees buckling beneath him. The world around him seemed to blur, the edges of his vision darkening. As he fell to the floor, his gaze locked on Margaret's face. Her smile was wider now, almost inhuman, her teeth sharp and glinting in the faint light. The last thing Thomas saw before everything went black was the reddish glow consuming the room, its pulsing rhythm matching the frantic beating of his heart. When Thomas awoke, the house was silent. The reddish light was gone, replaced by the pale gray of dawn filtering through the windows. He was lying on the floor, his body aching and his mind clouded with confusion. Edward's body was gone. So was Margaret. Thomas stumbled to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. He made his way outside, the cool morning air a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the house. As he looked back at the house, he noticed something strange. The windows, which had been cracked and dirty just hours before, were now pristine. The walls, once streaked with stains, looked freshly painted. It was as if nothing had ever happened. But Thomas knew better. The house might have been cleansed of its physical horrors, but the memories remained, etched into his mind like a scar. He turned and walked back to his cabin, his steps heavy with exhaustion. As he closed the door behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. And from the corner of his eye, he thought he saw a faint reddish glow flickering in the woods. Glenrothes was a village that rarely stirred before sunrise. But on this particular morning, the quiet was broken by the panicked tolling of the church bell. Thomas awoke with a start, his heart racing as the low, urgent clangs echoed through the valley. He had barely slept after the horrors of the previous night, and now his unease deepened into dread. Pulling on his boots, Thomas stepped outside into the misty dawn. The air was thick with moisture, and the sun, still low on the horizon, bathed the village in a pale, otherworldly light. From all directions, villagers were emerging from their homes, their faces etched with concern. They converged in the village square, where the constable, a stout man named Alistair, stood grim-faced near the church steps. "What's happened?" someone called out. "It's Edward and Margaret," Alistair said, his voice heavy. "They're dead." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Thomas felt his knees go weak. He had known this was coming. Somehow, he had felt the weight of this inevitability, but hearing the words spoken aloud brought it crashing down upon him like a physical blow. Alistair raised a hand, silencing the murmurs of the crowd. "We found them early this morning. It's not something the faint-hearted should see." "What killed them?" another voice called out. Alistair hesitated. "We're not sure," he admitted, "but it's strange. If you want to see for yourselves, come." Thomas followed the procession of villagers to Edward and Margaret's house. The dread in his chest deepened with every step. He wanted to turn back, to shut himself away from whatever new horror awaited. But he couldn't. He needed to see it, needed to understand. When they reached the house, Thomas noticed that it looked different. The windows, which had been dark and forbidding the night before, were now shattered. The door hung open, swinging slightly in the morning breeze. Blood smeared the front steps, a dark, congealed trail leading inside. Alistair stood at the doorway, barring the more curious villagers from entering. Only those who were prepared, he warned. Thomas stepped forward, and Alistair gave him a long, searching look before nodding. "Go ahead," he said quietly. The scene inside was worse than anything Thomas could have imagined. Edward and Margaret's bodies lay sprawled in the center of the room, their forms twisted and contorted as though they had been subjected to unspeakable agony. Edward's face was frozen in a grimace of pain, his eyes wide and bloodshot, while Margaret's lifeless gaze seemed to follow Thomas as he stepped inside. The walls were covered in scratches, deep gouges carved into the wood as if by clawed hands. Strange symbols, painted in what looked like blood, adorned the floor in a circular pattern around the bodies. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood and something else, something acrid and chemical that burned Thomas's nostrils. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Alistair stepped inside, his expression grim. "I was hoping you could tell us," he said. "You were the one who seemed to know something was wrong here." Thomas stiffened. I didn't know this would happen," he stammered. "I only suspected." "What did you suspect, Thomas?" Alistair's tone was sharp now, accusing. "You've been watching this house for weeks, haven't you? You've been telling people you heard strange things, saw strange lights. If you knew something, why didn't you speak up?" Thomas opened his mouth to protest, but the words died in his throat. What could he say? That he had seen Margaret alive and whole after finding her severed head? That Edward had tried to warn him about some unspeakable force? That he had fled in terror while the horrors unfolded? "I didn't think anyone would believe me," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Alistair's gaze was piercing. "You're right. I don't. But the rest of the village does. They're whispering." "Thomas, wondering how it is that you always seem to be near when strange things happen." Thomas felt a cold weight settle in his chest. He looked around at the other villagers, who were now peering into the house from the doorway and windows. Their faces were pale with fear, but their eyes held something else, suspicion. "I didn't do this," Thomas said, his voice rising. "I had nothing to do with this." "No one's accusing you," Alistair said, but the way he said it made it clear that the thought wasn't far from his mind. Over the following days, the village was consumed by speculation. Some believed Edward and Margaret had been cursed, victims of an ancient malice that had long haunted Glenrothes. Others whispered that they had brought it upon themselves, dabbling in things better left untouched. And then there were those who looked to Thomas. It started with furtive glances and whispered conversations that ceased when he entered the room. But soon, the suspicions grew bolder. People began to avoid him in the streets, their expressions a mixture of fear and distrust. When he tried to speak with his neighbors, they brushed him off with curt excuses. Thomas became increasingly isolated. The sense of unease that had plagued him for weeks now took on a new form, paranoia. He felt their eyes on him wherever he went, felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on him like a heavy stone. One night, as he sat alone in his cabin, he heard footsteps outside. At first, he thought he was imagining it, but then the sound came again, soft, deliberate, circling the house. Thomas's heart raced as he grabbed a lantern and moved to the window. In the faint light, he saw several figures standing in the distance, their faces obscured by the shadows. They weren't villagers, at least, not ones he recognized. Their silhouettes were strange, hunched and angular, as though their bodies had been warped by some unseen force. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling. The figures didn't respond. They stood motionless for a long moment before melting back into the shadows, disappearing into the woods. Thomas didn't sleep that night. The events of the past weeks had pushed him to his limit, and now he could no longer distinguish between reality and nightmare. The figures outside his cabin, the strange symbols in Edward and Margaret's house, the reddish glow that seemed to haunt his every step. What did it all mean? And why had he been drawn into it? The next morning, Thomas decided he couldn't stay in Glen Rothes any longer. He packed a small bag with what little he could carry and set out before dawn, determined to leave the village behind. But as he walked through the forest that bordered Glen Rothes, a strange feeling crept over him. The air grew colder, the trees pressing in on him like sentinels. The path, which he had walked countless times before, seemed unfamiliar, as though it had shifted in the night. He tried to focus, to keep moving forward, but no matter how far he walked, the forest seemed to stretch endlessly before him. And then, in the distance, he saw it, a faint reddish glow flickering through the trees. Thomas froze, his breath catching in his throat. He turned and ran, his heart pounding as he stumbled over roots and rocks. But no matter how fast he ran, the glow seemed to follow him, growing brighter and more insistent. When he finally emerged from the forest, gasping for breath, he found himself back in Glen Rothes. The village square was empty, the air heavy with an unnatural silence, and from the windows of Edward and Margaret's house, the reddish glow burned brighter than ever. Thomas fell to his knees, his body trembling as he stared at the house. The door was open, and inside, he could hear the faint sound of footsteps. They were waiting for him. The sun was low in the sky as the villagers gathered in the square, the tension in the air as thick as the mist that clung to the valley. The strange events surrounding Edward and Margaret's deaths had left Glen Rothes gripped by fear. Whispers of curses and ancient evils swirled through the crowd, but no one dared speak of them too loudly. Not yet. At the center of the square, Constable Alastair stood with a grim expression. Beside him was a man most of the villagers had never seen before, a ragged figure with unkempt hair and dirt-smudged clothes. His wrists were bound with coarse rope, and his face was pale and drawn, his eyes darting nervously from side to side. "This here's a thief," Alastair announced, his voice steady but tinged with unease. "We caught him skulking about the village last night, trying to break into one of your homes." The villagers murmured amongst themselves, their fear momentarily replaced by anger. Glen Rothes was not a place accustomed to outsiders, let alone criminals. "But," Alastair continued, raising his hand for silence, "this man claims to have been near Edward and Margaret's house the night they died. And what he says, well, you'll want to hear it for yourselves." The crowd fell silent, all eyes on the thief. The man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. He licked his lips nervously before speaking. I didn't mean no harm," he began, his voice shaking. "I didn't know what I was walking into. I swear it." "Go on," Alastair prompted. The thief took a deep breath. "It was late, past midnight, and I was looking for somewhere to lay low. I saw the house, Edward and Margaret's, and figured it'd be empty. No lights, no movement. Thought I could slip in and grab something, just enough to get me by. But as I got close, I heard noises." "What kind of noises?" a voice called from the crowd. The thief hesitated, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. "It wasn't like nothing I'd heard before. Scraping, like metal on stone. And this hum, low, like it was coming from the ground. It made my teeth ache." A ripple of unease passed through the villagers. Thomas, standing at the edge of the crowd, felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard that hum before. "I got closer, just to see what was going on," the thief continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And that's when I saw it. Through the window. Edward and Margaret, they weren't alone." The crowd gasped. "What do you mean?" Alastair demanded. "Who was with them?" The thief shook his head frantically. "Not who what. It wasn't human. Tall, hunched, with long arms that dragged the floor. Its skin was dark, like burnt wood, and its eyes, they glowed red, like embers. It was standing over them, moving its hands like it was pulling something out of the air." "What happened next?" someone asked, their voice trembling. The thief shuddered. Edward was screaming, but it wasn't just his voice. There was something else, like two voices coming out of him at the same time. Margaret, she wasn't moving, just laying there, staring at the ceiling with those dead eyes. He paused, his voice breaking, and then it turned. It looked right at me, like it knew I was there. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I ran, didn't stop till I was halfway to the next village. The square fell into stunned silence. The thief's story was absurd, impossible, and yet, no one doubted him. Not entirely, not after everything they had seen. As the crowd began murmuring again, Thomas stepped forward, his voice rising above the noise. "I believe him," he said. All eyes turned to him, and for a moment, he felt the weight of their suspicion, but he pressed on. "I've seen the glow," he continued. "I've heard the noises, and I've seen Margaret alive, after finding her head in a burlap bag." The crowd gasped again, but this time, it was different. There was fear, yes, but also a spark of understanding. They had all felt it, the sense that something was wrong in Glenrothes, something far beyond their comprehension. "I don't know what Edward and Margaret were involved in," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "But whatever it wasn't natural, and now it's here, in this village." The villagers murmured amongst themselves, their voices tinged with panic. Alistair held up his hand again, calling for order. "If there's truth to this," he said, "then we need to act. We need to stop it before it spreads." "How?" someone shouted. "We don't even know what it is." "Then we find out," Alistair replied. He turned to Thomas. "You've seen the most. If you've got any idea where to start, now's the time." Thomas hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "The house," he said finally. "Whatever this is, it started there. If we're going to find answers, that's where we'll find them." By nightfall, a small group had gathered at Edward and Margaret's house. Alistair led the way, his lantern casting flickering shadows on the dirt path. Thomas followed close behind, his stomach churning with a mixture of fear and determination. The house loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. The broken windows gaped like empty eye sockets, and the faint hum Thomas had heard before was back, vibrating through the ground beneath his feet. As they stepped inside, the air grew thick and oppressive. The symbols on the floor had faded, but their outlines were still visible, etched into the wood like scars. The reddish glow was absent, but the memory of it lingered, haunting the corners of Thomas's mind. "What are we looking for?" Alistair asked, his voice low. "I'm not sure," Thomas admitted, "but we'll know it when we see it." They moved cautiously through the house, their lanterns casting long shadows on the walls. The hum grew louder as they descended into the cellar, a narrow, cramped space that smelled of damp earth and decay. In the center of the cellar, they found it. A crude altar had been constructed from stones and wood, its surface smeared with dark stains. Strange artifacts, bones, feathers, and what looked like human teeth were arranged around it in intricate patterns. At the center of the altar was a book, its leather cover cracked and worn with age. Alistair reached for the book, but Thomas stopped him. "Don't touch it," he warned. "Not yet." He leaned closer, squinting at the strange symbols etched into the cover. They were unlike anything he had ever seen. A swirling, chaotic script that seemed to pulse with an energy of its own. "What is it?" Alistair asked. "I don't know," Thomas said, "but it's not something good." As they stood there, the hum grew louder, the air vibrating with a palpable tension, and then, from somewhere above them, they heard the sound of footsteps. The group froze, their breaths caught in their throats. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving across the floor above them. "We're not alone," Alistair whispered. Thomas's heart pounded as the footsteps grew louder, descending the stairs toward the cellar. The lanterns flickered, their light casting eerie shadows on the walls. And then the figure appeared at the top of the stairs. It was tall and gaunt, its skin dark and cracked like burnt wood. Its eyes glowed red, twin embers that pierced the darkness. It moved slowly, its long arms dragging against the walls as it descended. The group backed away, their lanterns shaking in their hands. The figure stopped at the bottom of the stairs, its head tilting as it regarded them with an unnatural stillness. "What do we do?" someone whispered. Thomas's mind raced, his fear threatening to consume him. But then he remembered the thief's words, the creature's connection to the symbols, the altar, the book. "Destroy it," he said, his voice firm. "Destroy the altar. Destroy the book." Alistair hesitated for only a moment before swinging his lantern at the altar. The glass shattered, flames erupting as the oil spilled across the surface. The creature let out a deafening screech, its glowing eyes flaring with rage. "Keep going," Thomas shouted. The others joined in, smashing the altar to pieces and throwing the book into the flames. The creature howled, its body writhing as the fire consumed its connection to this world. And then, with a final, ear-splitting scream, it vanished. The cellar fell silent, the oppressive hum fading into nothingness. As the flames died down, the group stood in stunned silence, their breaths ragged and their faces pale. "It's over," Alistair said finally, his voice barely audible. But Thomas wasn't so sure. As they climbed the stairs and emerged into the night, he cast one last glance at the house. The faint reddish glow was gone, but in the shadows, he thought he saw something move, just a flicker, a suggestion of a figure. And deep in his heart, he knew the nightmare was far from over. The next morning, Glen Rothis was cloaked in an uneasy stillness. The destruction of the altar and the creature's retreat had done little to calm the villagers. If anything, their fear had deepened. What had been contained to Edward and Margaret's house had now spilled into the open, and no one could deny the darkness that lingered over the village. The whispers began as soon as the sun rose. At first, they were subtle, furtive exchanges in corners and alleyways. But by midday, the tension in the village had reached a boiling point, and the whispers turned into open accusations. "Thomas was there when it all started," one woman said, her voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "And how does he always seem to know so much?" another added. "He's been skulking around that house for weeks," an older man muttered. "Watching, waiting. Maybe he brought this upon us." By evening, the entire village seemed united in their suspicion of Thomas. It didn't matter that he had helped destroy the altar or that he had nearly died in the process. Fear and anger had clouded their judgment, and Thomas had become their scapegoat. Thomas sat in his cabin, the weight of the villagers' suspicion pressing down on him like a physical force. He had seen the way they looked at him earlier that day, the fear in their eyes, the way they stepped back as he passed, as though he carried some infectious curse. A loud knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the latch. "Thomas," Alistair's voice called from the other side. "Open up. We need to talk." Thomas opened the door cautiously. Alistair stood on the porch, flanked by two of the bulliest men in the village. Their expressions were hard, unreadable. "What is it?" Thomas asked, his voice wary. "We need answers," Alistair said, his tone firm but not unkind. "The village is scared, and they're looking to you for an explanation." Thomas frowned. "You think I did this?" Alistair shook his head. "I don't know what to think, but people are talking, and if you don't explain yourself, it's only going to get worse." Thomas sighed and stepped aside, gesturing for them to come in. The three men entered the cabin, their presence making the small space feel even more cramped. Alistair sat at the table, motioning for Thomas to do the same. "Start from the beginning," he said. "Tell us everything you know." Thomas took a deep breath and began to recount everything he had seen and experienced since the strange events began. He told them about the noises coming from Edward and Margaret's house, the eerie reddish glow, and the night he found the burlap bag with Margaret's severed head. He described the creature he had seen in the cellar, its unnatural movements, and the symbols on the altar. He told them about the thief's account, about Edward's last words, and Margaret's transformation into something far from human. When he finished, the room was silent. Alistair rubbed his chin thoughtfully, while the two other men exchanged uneasy glances. "That's quite a tale," Alistair said finally, "but it doesn't explain why all of this started in the first place." "I don't know why," Thomas admitted. But it had nothing to do with me. I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or the right place. One of the men muttered under his breath. Thomas's eyes narrowed. What's that supposed to mean? The man shrugged, his expression defiant. Maybe you brought it here. Maybe you were dabbling in something you shouldn't have. And now we're all paying the price. That's ridiculous. Thomas snapped. I've done nothing but try to help. Enough, Alistair said, raising a hand. We're not here to point fingers. But Thomas, you have to understand, people are scared. And when people are scared, they look for someone to blame. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. So what now? Do you turn the whole village against me? Alistair shook his head. No, but if you want to clear your name, you need to help us figure out what's really going on here. The following day, Alistair and Thomas, accompanied by a small group of villagers, returned to Edward and Margaret's house. Though the altar had been destroyed, the group hoped to find more clues about what had caused the events that had plunged Glenrothes into darkness. The house was as they had left it, eerie and silent, the faint smell of burned wood lingering in the air. The group split up, each person tasked with searching a different part of the house. Thomas focused on the study, a small, cluttered room filled with books, papers, and odd trinkets. As he sifted through the mess, he came across a leather-bound journal tucked beneath a pile of loose papers. The cover was embossed with the initials EM. He opened the journal carefully, his heart racing as he scanned the first few pages. The handwriting was Edward's, neat and precise, though it grew more erratic as the entries progressed. The early entries were mundane, filled with observations about the weather, the state of the garden, and Margaret's health. But as Thomas read on, the tone shifted. One entry, dated several months ago, caught his attention. The dreams have returned. Margaret says I've been speaking in my sleep, but I can't remember what I said. Only fragments remain when I wake. Red light. Shadows moving in the corner of my vision. A voice calling my name. It feels like something is trying to reach me. Something ancient and terrible. Another entry, written weeks later, was more alarming. Margaret found the book in the attic today. She says it's been here for generations, passed down from her grandmother. The symbols on the cover are strange, but there's a pull to them, like they're speaking directly to me. Margaret says we should burn it, but I can't. Not yet. There's something here, some secret waiting to be uncovered. The final entries were nearly illegible, the handwriting frantic and scrawled across the page. It's too late. I've opened something. Margaret, she's not herself anymore. I hear it at night, moving through the house, watching, waiting. God help us. Thomas shared the journal with Alistair and the others, who listened in stunned silence. When he finished reading, the room erupted into chaos. This proves it, one man shouted. The book was the cause of all this. But Thomas found the journal, another argued. How do we know he didn't write it himself to cover his tracks? Thomas's protests were drowned out by the rising voices. The fear and paranoia that had simmered beneath the surface now boiled over, and the villagers' suspicion turned fully upon him. Alistair tried to calm the crowd, but it was no use. The villagers surged forward, shouting accusations and demanding that Thomas be punished. You brought this curse upon us, one woman screamed. Burn him, another shouted. Burn him and be done with it. Realizing he was in danger, Thomas pushed through the crowd, his heart pounding as he bolted out of the house and into the night. The villagers gave chase, their voices echoing through the darkness. Thomas ran blindly, his only thought to escape. He fled into the woods, the trees closing in around him as he stumbled over roots and branches. The shouts of the villagers grew fainter, but his fear did not abate. He ran until his legs gave out, collapsing onto the forest floor. As he lay there, gasping for breath, he felt a strange sensation, a faint hum vibrating through the ground. Lifting his head, he saw it, the reddish glow, flickering faintly in the distance. Despite his exhaustion, Thomas forced himself to his feet and moved toward the light. He didn't know what he would find, but he had no other choice. The village had turned against him, and the answers he sought lay ahead. In the heart of the darkness, As he stepped into the glow, the hum grew louder, filling his ears and drowning out all other sounds. And then, with a sudden, blinding flash, everything went silent. The forest disappeared, and Thomas found himself standing in a vast, empty space, the reddish light surrounding him like a living thing. And in the center of the light stood a figure, tall and gaunt, its glowing eyes fixed on him. "It's you," Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, its voice echoing in his mind. "You opened the door." Thomas's blood ran cold. "No," he said, shaking his head. "It wasn't me." The figure took a step closer, its presence overwhelming. "You will finish what was started." As the light engulfed him, Thomas felt himself falling, the world dissolving into darkness. And then there was nothing. Thomas awoke to the suffocating weight of silence, his body cold and trembling. For a moment, he thought he was still lying in the forest, surrounded by mist and the accusing voices of the villagers. But as his eyes adjusted, he realized he was somewhere far more alien. The air was thick, heavy, and faintly glowing with a pulsating red hue that stretched endlessly in all directions. There were no trees, no horizon, just the dull, throbbing light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. He tried to move, but his limbs were sluggish, as though something unseen was pressing him down. He turned his head and saw the figure. It stood a short distance away, its tall, gaunt silhouette impossible to mistake. Its glowing red eyes pierced through the haze, fixing on him with an intensity that felt as though it were peeling apart his very thoughts. Thomas's breath came in shallow gasps as he tried to pull himself upright, his body screaming with effort. The creature tilted its head slightly, its long arms hanging unnaturally at its sides. "You should not have followed," the voice came, though it was not a sound in the air. It reverberated inside Thomas's skull, a vibration that seemed to come from the very core of his being. "You have tethered yourself. The door cannot close without you." Thomas struggled to his feet, his legs shaky beneath him. His voice cracked as he spoke, the sound small and insignificant in the vastness around him. "I didn't open anything. I didn't ask for any of this." He choked on his own words as the creature stepped closer. Its movements were deliberate, slow, each step seeming to resonate through the ground, though there was no visible surface beneath them. "You were called," the voice continued, as calm and cold as ever. "You answered. Fear binds you. Denial anchors you. You feed the door." Thomas took a step back, his chest tightening with panic. He didn't understand what the creature meant, but he knew instinctively that he didn't want to be here, didn't want to face whatever had drawn him into this nightmare. "I don't know what you're talking about. Let me go, please." The creature's eyes flared, and suddenly Thomas's vision blurred. He was no longer in the glowing expanse, but back in Glen Rothes, standing outside Edward and Margaret's house. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the faint hum he had come to dread thrummed through the ground. The house loomed before him, its windows dark and lifeless, though the faintest glow of red pulsed from within. Thomas felt his legs moving toward it, though he wasn't sure whether he was walking of his own volition or being pulled by some unseen force. As he stepped through the doorway, the house seemed larger than before, the walls stretching upward into darkness. The symbols on the floor burned faintly, their lines pulsating with the same rhythm as the hum. And there, in the center of the room, was the book. Its cracked leather cover was worn and ancient, the symbols on its surface shifting and writhing as though alive. The memories came flooding back in a torrent. He saw Edward hunched over the book, his face pale and gaunt, muttering words that twisted and bent the air around him. He saw Margaret standing in the shadows, her body rigid, her eyes unblinking as the red glow consumed her. He felt their fear, their desperation, their foolish hope that they could control something far older and more powerful than themselves. And then he saw himself, watching, waiting, always drawn back to the house as though tied to it by invisible threads. "You are the tether," the voice echoed in his mind, pulling him back to the present. "Without you, the door cannot close. Without you, it will remain open." Thomas's gaze locked on the book. He knew, deep down, that this was the source, the anchor that held the nightmare in place. But as he stepped closer, the air around it seemed to grow heavier, pressing against him with an almost physical force. The hum grew louder, resonating through his bones, and the red light flared, casting long, writhing shadows across the walls. The creature appeared at the edge of the room, its glowing eyes fixed on him. "You will finish what they began," it said, its voice colder now, harsher, "or you will be consumed." Thomas clenched his fists, his mind racing. He wanted to destroy the book, to end whatever horror had taken root in Glenrothes. But fear gripped him. What if destroying it unleashed something even worse? What if this was all a trap? A manipulation by the creature to make him do its bidding? Before he could decide, the symbols on the floor began to pulse faster, their light growing brighter. The air vibrated with a low, menacing growl, and the shadows on the walls twisted and writhed as though alive. Thomas stumbled back, his heart pounding as the room seemed to collapse inward, the walls pressing closer, the red light consuming everything. Suddenly, the hum reached a deafening crescendo, and the book flew open. Pages turned on their own, the symbols on them glowing with an otherworldly light. From the pages, tendrils of red energy erupted, twisting through the air like serpents. They lashed out, striking the walls, the floor, and finally, Thomas. He screamed as the tendrils wrapped around him, their energy burning through his skin and into his mind. Images flooded his vision, endless, shifting landscapes of fire and shadow, ancient beings with eyes like stars, and the infinite void of the door that had been opened. He saw Glenrothes consumed by the red light, its people twisted into unrecognizable shapes, their screams echoing through eternity. "You are the bridge," the creature's voice boomed, deafening now, a roar that shook the very fabric of the house. "You must choose." Thomas felt himself being pulled in two directions. On one side, the book called to him, its power offering the promise of an end to the nightmare. On the other, the creature loomed, its eyes burning with an intensity that threatened to consume him entirely. He realized, in that moment, that he was not just a victim of this horror. He was its linchpin. Everything revolved around him, and his actions would determine the fate of not just Glenrothes, but perhaps something far greater. With a surge of defiance, Thomas reached for the book, his fingers closed around its edges, the heat searing his skin, but he held on. The symbols on the pages burned brighter, their light almost blinding, and the tendrils of energy tightened around him, pulling him closer. He could feel the creature watching, its presence overwhelming, but he refused to let go. As he tore the book from its pedestal, the entire house shook. The symbols on the floor flared one final time before disintegrating, their light exploding outward in a wave of red energy. The tendrils evaporated, the hum ceased, and the red glow faded into darkness. Thomas collapsed to the floor, the book clutched tightly in his hands. The silence that followed was absolute, a void that pressed against his ears and filled his mind with an almost unbearable emptiness. Slowly, he lifted his head and looked around. The house was still and lifeless, its walls blackened and crumbling. The creature was gone. He staggered to his feet, his body weak and trembling, and stepped outside. The village of Glenrothes lay in ruins. The houses were nothing more than charred husks, their roofs caved in and their windows shattered. The square was empty, the fountain dry and cracked. Not a single soul remained. Thomas stood in the middle of the square, the book still in his hands, and stared at the desolation around him. The air was still, the sky above a dull, lifeless gray. He had ended the nightmare, but at what cost? The village was gone, consumed by the darkness he had fought so hard to destroy. As he looked down at the book, its symbols now dull and lifeless, a single thought entered his mind. Was it truly over? In the distance, beyond the ruins of Glenrothes, a faint reddish glow flickered on the horizon.